Welcome to Worth Your Time with your hosts from the nationally syndicated Bob and Tom Show, Kristi Lee, and the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, Dr. Rob Shumaker. Our mission to inform, entertain, and educate with guests from all aspects of life. We guarantee there isn't another podcast that features two hosts with such different backgrounds and discussions with remarkable people doing exceptional things. So let's get started. Here are your hosts, Kristi Lee and Dr. Rob Shumaker.
How are you, Kristi?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. We are launching into a really interesting topic for me today, something that has a little bit of history for me when I was in graduate school and some professional affiliations for me, but I'm really excited because we're going to talk to a guy that I have never met, but I've known his work for many years and respected him and admire him, a guy named Dr. Allen Dugatkin. Lee, we are thrilled you're here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been looking forward to it.
Lee, I have to say something right off the top of the show. I drag Dr. Rob into these podcasts a lot of times with subjects he knows nothing about, really, or very little. Tattooing and psychics. Yeah, and
it happens.
he has,
and I love it.
And he has brought me in today to learn me about animal behavior because I am embarrassed to say know nothing about this subject. Nothing.
You're not going to be able to say that when we're done.
Good. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are going to be just as informed as I am, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Lee, I was telling Kristi, you have a phenomenal career, and my entry point into your career was with Guppies. When I was studying orangutan social learning years and years ago, obviously was reading your work and referencing your work, and this was early in my career as a graduate student. And what a phenomenal number of studies you have on guppies. And when I mentioned that to Kristi, her response was,
Guppies? Why guppies?
That's often the response.
So tell us a little bit about how you got into social learning with guppies, and that'll move us into our talking a little bit about your recent book.
Sure. When I was in grad school, I was doing my PhD in the late 80s. And so that work was actually on the evolution of cooperation. And the guppy system allowed me to do all sorts of experimental work to understand the evolution of prosocial behavior like cooperation and altruism. And I won't go into the details on that, but basically I was set up to do that work. And I was reading a lot about guppy behavior just in general. And it turns out that people had, even in the late 80s, already done a tremendous amount of work on how guppies choose their mates. And this is a really big, important topic in animal behavior because choosing your mates and producing offspring, that's the key to understanding how evolution and natural selection work. So I was reading up on that a little bit. And the thing was that everything I was reading suggested that we now, even then, had a pretty decent understanding of the genetics behind how females were choosing their mates. And in guppies, like in lots of animals, it's females who select among males as their mates. And from the other work I was doing on the evolution of cooperation and altruism, I realized that guppy social behavior is really quite sophisticated. They have all these kind of if-then rules. If another guppy does this, then I do that. And so I began to think that social and cultural factors might play an important role in mate choice in guppies. And so I started designing these experiments that basically asked a really simple question to start with, which was that were females copying the mate choice that other females were displaying? So I would have experiments in the laboratory and there'd be a female and she could watch another female choose one male over another. And then I could ask, does she then prefer that male? And it took a long time because it's complicated to get at that sort of thing. But basically, I was finding they pay attention and they copy the mate choice of others in their groups, and eventually was able to actually start tinkering around and ask how important were those social and cultural factors compared to the genetics of mate choice. And it turns out under some conditions, this cultural copying overrides the genetic preferences, and under other conditions, genetic preferences completely mask any social and copying effects.
What were those conditions?
So in with respect to the genetics, basically the story revolves around color.
Okay.
And so if males have lots and lots of color, generally speaking, females prefer them over other males. And so what you can show is that if the males are close in the amount of color they have, or even if one male has a little bit more color than the other, then you might still copy the choice of another female, even if she doesn't like the colorful male. But if they are dramatically different, if one male is much, much more colorful than the other, then the genetic predisposition, the genetic choice for the more colorful male will basically mask all the copying and cultural effects.
What I have to say that I love about your work so much, Lee, and I think this was a great example of it, it's so unexpected to find that level of complexity in guppies, at least for me.
Sure.
If you were talking about orcas, I don't think people would be super surprised that there's a lot of complexity, or dolphins or gorillas or whatever, but guppies. And that's what I love, because you explore these really complex topics in species where it's super unexpected and surprising, and it's there.
How do you keep track of which guppy is a guppy? How do you tell them apart? I'm sorry, this is...
That matters.
So it depends on where you're doing it. So some of the work I did was actually in the streams where they naturally are swimming around, which is in Trinidad. And there it's difficult to know one guppy from another. There are some ways you can tell males apart because they have unique color patterns, but it's hard. When you're in the laboratory, you can videotape things as one means for going back and slowly looking at the videotapes. And you can nowadays, there's actually software where you can sort of circle on a screen a guppy, and it'll keep track of that guppy for you, even in a group.
Wow.
When I was doing it, that software wasn't there, but there were other ways that you could do it by watching videos over and over again. And then I should say also, there are certain experiments, like the initial experiments that we were just talking about on copying and culture, where basically the animals can be in separate little canisters for most of the experiments. So I can keep track. It's not nearly as difficult, right? I know what fish I put where. And so there are any number of ways that you can do this sort of thing. And like I say, nowadays, the software is just mind-blowing in terms of keeping track of little things like this. And in terms of the surprise factor in finding this in something like guppies, you can basically fit their brain on the head of a pin.
Right.
And when I was doing this work in the late 80s, this animal behavior as a field has been around for a long time. There's a sort of subsection of animal behavior, and Rob will know what I mean, called behavioral ecology, that was newer. And it was in this subdiscipline that people were developing ideas about these very sophisticated social rules that might operate in animals. And we were just at that time really starting to tinker around with looking at those rules, those sophisticated social rules, in things besides the normal suspects. Obviously, you would be looking for this kind of thing in chimpanzees and orcas and orangutans and whatever else along those lines. But people began to become more interested in the possibility that organisms that you might not normally think are capable of these behaviors are. And once it was demonstrated that was the case, then it opened up this floodgate of incredible studies that were done and are still being done today.
What a gift for the field to give people those opportunities and those insights, because there's only so many people who can study orcas.
Sure.
It's hard. But to allow people to pursue their interests, or the biologists or conservation biologists, evolutionary biologists, whatever, on this wide variety of species. What a gift, Lee. Well done. I think that's huge.
I was just one cog in the machine, but yes, like you say, it's just, if you're limited to studying orcas and primates, it's difficult. It's difficult because there aren't And it's also difficult because the ethical considerations are much deeper. But if you can study this in these complex social behaviors in almost anything, then it opens the door to this very deep understanding of the evolution of social behavior. And I have to say that original work on copying was part of what got me eventually interested in more complex things like these animal social networks that people are studying today.
Did you notice that seamless transition to the book Lee just gave us?
Yes, I did.
I try.
That was that was so
He's done
smooth.
this before.
Oh, he's smooth.
Uh-huh.
In case anybody is not aware, and you should be, Lee's new book is called The Well-Connected Animal, subtitle, Social Networks and the Wondrous Complexity of Animal Societies. First of all, this is a great book, and it is interesting to anybody who's in the field. I think very interesting to anyone in the field, but also super interesting to a general audience. This is a very readable, awesome book. I would encourage anybody to think about it. And I would love to, sorry, Kristi's
No, I
got a
just
big question.
no. I've got a lot of questions.
Okay, go.
Are you kidding?
Go.
I don't know anything. So, social networks. What animal that you have studied surprised you the most? That has the most complex social network?
I was saying that when I was studying the guppies in terms of their culture and copying, that was very much a kind of one guppy watches another guppy. And at the same, not that much later, I started doing work on fighting behavior in swordtail fish, which are another small fish that you can find in Mexico. And there, what they were doing was they were actually spying on others when those others were fighting, and they would use the information that they gleaned from those fights, and they would use it when they actually encountered one of those individuals that they were spying on.
Isn't that fantastic?
That is so amazing.
It's fantastic. And I love the vocabulary of things like copying and spying. People would have hesitated to use that describing animals. I love that you're doing that because it's so accurate, and those are the right words.
Spying on fights?
Hey.
We can't talk about that. You can't talk about Fight Club.
So these swordtails, the males have anywhere from mild to super aggressive interactions where they lock jaws and are fighting intensely. And the interesting thing is that we knew a decent amount about the fighting behavior, but one of my PhD students, Ryan Early at the time, and I were really interested in this notion that other individuals, that we weren't the only ones who were watching these fights, right? So we were thinking other fish in their group would really, if they could get information by watching others and then use that themselves. If you see two individuals fight and one beats the hell out of the other, that's pretty important information for you to have when you encounter one of them. You're going to stay away from someone who wins a lot of fights, and you might be more willing to get into a scrum with somebody who loses. And I think I am actually someone I'm very aware of this idea of anthropomorphism. So just to step back, anthropomorphism is using the language of human interactions to explain what animals are doing. And there's good and there's bad to that. When I talk about spying, I can't think of a better word to describe
exactly
what they're doing. There are some instances when you're studying animal behavior, you have to be really careful because there's a lot of, when you use words like that, you're implying a lot, and you really want to be sure that what you're implying applies to animals, non-humans. In this case, I really think it does. But the thing is that, so getting back to your question, what's the most interesting thing I was studying in social networks? Both the guppies copying and the swordtail spying, these are kind of small social networks. They're basically three animals. One is either spying on the others, or one is just basically taking in what the others do in terms of choosing mates and using it. So they're like little small networks. But now and nowadays, there's all this incredible work that's being done on everything from chimpanzees and dolphins to field crickets, where people, and vampire bats and many other things, where people are looking at social networks in a much bigger sense, in the sense that we use a social network where there are many individuals and all of them are connected. And when I say connected, either information is moving between them or somehow or another, what one does directly or indirectly affects what the others do. And not just in small groups of 3, but in groups of 10 and 20 and 50. And so my own work has mostly been on this in Guppies and Swordtails. But in the book, what I do is I talk with these remarkable researchers, and I should say many of them are really young, which is exciting, who are looking at these complex social networks all over the world, in every species you can imagine, and really helping to understand a much deeper view of just how complex social behavior is. And if you think that copying in the Guppies and spying in the Swordtails was complex, it's really nothing compared to the kind of work that people are doing today in dolphins and vampire bats and chimpanzees and marmots and endless species. And the people who are doing this, essentially what they have done, essentially what animal behaviorists did when they became interested in this, was initially, they basically stole all of the mathematics and all of the underlying stuff that goes behind, for example, building Facebook and building X and all these social networks they were part of. These are built on these very complex algorithms. We stole how you study social networks from that group and brought it in and looked at how you can use this to study social networks in non-humans. Nowadays, we're actually contributing back and showing all new techniques that we're developing that now the Facebook, Twitter, X community is now trying to incorporate into their systems.
Wow. Yeah, that people are spying on me on Twitter all the time. I just know it. No, I have a question about this swordtail thing.
She's stuck on the fish.
I am. So they're fighting. Does that make them more attractive to the females? Or are they just fighting to keep the other males away from their female? Why are they fighting?
Yeah. In Swordtails, right now, all we really know is they're fighting. Typically speaking, the winners of the fights have more access to mating opportunities. But in other species, including other species of fish, animal behaviorists have now been studying what are known as audience effects. Just to step back for a second, people have known for a very long time that in many systems, if males win fights, they have preferential access to females. And so in a sense, that's old news for people who study animal behavior. It may not be old news in general, but we've known this for a very long time.
And just to clarify, because they've intimidated or moved other males out of the
Scared them
arena.
away. Yeah.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that there's some data that suggests that the females themselves are then preferentially choosing the ones that win. So it's a combination of pushing everybody else away, but it's also that they become more attractive by winning these fights. Now, the audience effect adds this layer of even more complexity to the system. So what animal behaviorists have shown is that males will fight pretty much any time because they're fighting not just, for example, opportunities to mate, but they're fighting for the best place to live, or they're fighting to get the best food. And so they may be doing some of this fight from females, where sometimes they may just be fighting over a piece of food and there's nobody else around. They'll fight. What's remarkable is that the males fight differently when they know they're being watched by females. And so this is known as the audience effect, because what you have essentially are individuals who are actors in a sense, who act differently depending upon who the audience is. If it's nobody, they may do one thing. If it's females who are watching, then you might, for example, get a much more ramped up fight where when somebody wins, there's no doubt about it. Whereas if females aren't watching, maybe the fights are not quite as wild. So being watched by an audience affects what you do, affects what you yourself will do later. So there are these phenomena called winner and loser effects in animals as well. And so basically, if you win a fight, that alone makes you more likely to win another fight. If you lose a fight, that alone makes you more likely to lose a fight. So basically, animals get on winning streaks and losing streaks, and all of these things they're all playing out at the same time. It's not so there are winner effects, loser effects, bystand audience effects, spying effects, all of these things going on at the same time, and they're all going on in these social networks.
It's incredible.
Now, I know both Lee, you and Kristi are going to resist me now. But I'm going to see is there any possibility, even though I'm loving it, I want to pivot away from fish for just a minute.
No, go ahead.
I'm loving the guppies. I'm loving the swordtails.
I didn't have anything else to report.
I think we should absolutely, because there's just so much.
So you mentioned the idea of these dyads and triads and so on, but the things can get much bigger and much more complex with many more numbers of animals. Can you talk about, and wow, you do a brilliant job in your book talking about this, the Cayo Santiago macaques. Now, I know that's probably not so familiar. Yeah. These are monkeys that, I'll let you describe it, but they live on the Cayo Santiago Island, and you do an incredible job, to me, particularly fascinating, talking about the female relationships in all these macaques. Can you talk about that as one of these examples of larger social networks?
No, absolutely. And it's actually one of my favorites. So I'm happy to. And this is work that's been going on for a very long time. So the social network work is led by Lauren Brent, who's an absolutely fantastic animal behaviorist primatologist. So just a little bit of background so the social network stuff makes sense. Cayo Santiago is this little island off of mainland Puerto Rico. And it's this remarkable place because essentially the relationship between the monkeys that live on the island and humans is completely flipped on its head. What happened was, in about 70 years ago, there were no macaques, these small monkeys that nowadays there are about 2,000 of them or so on the island. There were no macaques on the island because they're not native to that area. A primatologist went over to India, caught 500 of them, brought them back on a steamship. And this was like a story that was covered by Life magazine. It was such a big deal. And he put them on the island. And basically, they have the run of the island. Humans come on, animal behaviorists basically, come onto the island each morning on a little ferry, and then they leave later in the day. And there are no humans on the island otherwise. And what's more, when humans come onto the island, they have to keep themselves in cages a fair share of the time. And the animals always have complete run of the island. Now, humans have run of the island some of the time when they're studying them, but everything is upside down in terms of that relationship, which is great. The monkeys have the island, and we're there as visitors and allowed to do certain things. As I say, there are somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 of the monkeys that are on the island, depending on when you're looking. And so Lauren Brent and her team were studying social networks in these macaques. And as Rob said, she was particularly fascinated with females. All of the macaques are known individually by any number of different ways that they have, from photos to little markings that are made on the animals and so on. So they knew who's who. And it turns out that if you look at these social networks in females, what you find is that females who have lots of associates, that is, lots of individuals that they have social interactions with, and particularly important social interactions, revolve around, Rob, this all too well, grooming behavior, which means that what the animals are doing, they have parasites and all sorts of nasty stuff on the outside, on their body all over. Some of it they can get off themselves, but there are parts that it's really hard to pick them off yourself. And so what happens is other macaques in the group will groom you. They'll pull those things off. And it's a really important social behavior. It's also really important for health because it gets away the nasty stuff. Mm-hmm. So females who have lots of friends in their grooming network, right? That is, individuals who will help them, and to some extent, some might help you a lot, some might help you a little. That affects your survivorship. So if you have lots and lots of friends who are in this grooming network of yours, you have higher survivorship than females who aren't as well connected in that group. But it turns out that it's even deeper than this. And so one of the cool things about studying social networks is that it turns out in these macaques and in many other species that friends of friends matter. And so what I mean is the more friends that your friends have, the better it is for you. And it turns out that the more friends of friends that a female had in these grooming networks, the more offspring she produced. So these things are translating into, we're talking about the meat of what evolution and natural selection are operating on, the number of babies you produce. If you're well embedded in one of these grooming networks, both in terms of having lots of friends and having friends themselves that are well connected, you do better.
Wow.
You survive longer, and then you also have more babies. So now Lauren is studying these monkeys, and she's learning, and her whole team, I should say, there's a large number of people involved, including many people who are local, who are critical to the team. They live in, they're Puerto Ricans who are coming there, working on the system. And so she has this general sense of these grooming networks. And then in 2017, Hurricane Maria hits.
Lee, let's break here and we'll come back with that. Can we do that?
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break. First of all, I have a great friend network. We don't pick parasites off each other, but we do drink a lot of wine and we have lots of babies. That's how that works in humans.
Don't give up on the parasites.
I'm not going to pick off parasites off my friends. Such fascinating things that we are learning today.
Yeah, we're talking to Lee Allen Dugatkin, and Lee's an evolutionary biologist and of particular interest to me, also a historian of science, and he's at the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. And all of this and a lot more is in his newest book called The Well-Connected Animal, which is absolutely terrific, easily available just about anywhere. And Lee, we are going to take a quick break, and we will be back.
You've been listening to Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and Kristi Lee. If you like what you hear, please give a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best compliment. Thanks to our producers, Chris Spangle of Leaders and Legends, LLC. You can reach him at leadersandlegends.net. Also, thanks to Sophie Ritz. I'm Christopher Geisen. Thanks for joining us.